Yes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. I am joined by our good friends Sistrum and Osiris. We're going to be talking about why World War II was a thing. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I will not be editing out because I'm too lazy for that shit. Osiris, let everyone know who you are, just in case they don't know who you are, and then we'll do the same for Sistrum.
Oh shit, man! I don't know more. I'm Osiris. Osiris on Twitch. Osiris everywhere. Google it, and you'll find all the things that I don't do anymore. I'm just lazy on the internet. Okay. All right. Cool.
Fair enough. And Sistrum.
I'm just Sistrom. I'm a random dude on the internet.
All right, fair enough. Go ahead.
But yeah, that's it. I'm just a random dude on the internet.
All right, fantastic. So apparently, Osiris and System were having a conversation about World War II, why World War II happened, all of the wonderful stuff with that. I've gotten some details thrown at me where I've kind of understand a little bit what's going on, but fill me in, guys. Fill the audience in, and then I'll add in where I want, or where I can. Excuse me.
Right, so our discussion actually ended up more in the how the construction, basically the way that the Axis kind of came together, and how the end of their dynasties, like for Japan and basically because the Germans basically were rising up to because they were defeated in World War I, and they kind of imploded and then became a fascist society, and same thing with Italy. In their choices. That was my understanding. And then that, escalated. But our biggest part of the conversation was whether Japan could have actually structurally attacked the United States and actually conquered the Hawaiian Islands and actually invaded the U.S. That was where our conversation kind of went. And then we kind of went back and forth, and then it evolved into a conversation more about like how that impacts how the United States engaging Japan, and then also at the same time engaging in Europe, how that impacted the way that we view the world today and how we view ourselves, and how the World War II impacted that.
All right, yeah, there's definitely a lot of content under that. If you guys want to put your summations first, feel free to do so. I can just start rambling off.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Sister, but I think my point of view was, like he said, it started. I mean, the point of contention became: did Japan have any real, not opportunity, but a chance to do any real damage to mainland United States? I could put up the hypothetical argument. They could have probably did the same thing we did in Island Hop, took over Hawaii, used that as a base of operations. But even then, I don't see it happening. Not a chance in hell. But then from that point forward, yeah, I don't remember exactly. I don't know if we had any other contentious things, but that was the starting point. So we can start from there if you want.
And Sistrum, do you agree with this?
I mean, the thing is that Japan was a warring island empire for a very, very long time, including the fact that they conquered pretty much up to that point. They had gone through and conquered about 80% of any enemy around them, including China. And there's a few times where there's only been one other nation that was able to do that, and then it incorporated itself into China. So, and of course, China also ended up in a civil war, which kind of has to do with Taiwan too. So that's a whole discussion in itself.
True. All right, so there's a lot of history here, but we'll take the base premise here. Could Japan have attacked the United States? Largely, if we're talking about the mainland of the United States, the answer is no. Or if they were going to do that in any kind of comparable way, two things. Either one, they're rolling, they're constantly rolling sixes, and I'm using that as a bit of a hyperbolic term. But to actually get to the point where they could invade the United States proper, if you will, the lower 48, they've got a lot of work to do. Remind you that Hawaii is still a significant amount of distance away from the United States proper, and there's not really any other bases to set up between there and or here and there. But what did happen during World War II that most people forget about is that some of the Alaskan islands were actually invaded. It's the only U.S. sovereign territory that was ever invaded during the entire war. They could have gone more with the Alaska route, but of course, you know, that's cold and snowy and terrible and all that. That was never their goal, though. A lot of people forget that when you usually launch a war, you have a set of war aims and war goals, and you have a doctrine and how you're going to win the war. Japan never had the idea that they were going to attack the mainland United States. That wasn't what they set out to do. The main reason they get in the war, actually there's a number of reasons, but the number one reason that they cannot avoid war with the United States is because the Philippines is a U.S. imperial possession at the time. And it is, there's a whole lot of other stuff I'm going to skip over here for a quick minute, but Japan realizes because the Americans had shut off trade to them earlier in the year, in 1941, that they have to go get at resources elsewhere. Most of what they need that's left over is in an island called Borneo. That's in the Indonesian archipelago. But right directly between Indonesia and Japan is the Philippines, which is a U.S. protectorate and a U.S. base. They can't allow that. And so their whole plan, in a nutshell, is we're going to come in, we're going to beat the living dog shit out of the Americans before they can mobilize. And in a grand climactic battle, either one, we are going to scare them so shitless that they'll get out. And some believe that this would actually happen because they're racist as hell. But two, if they didn't do that, they would cripple the United States anywhere between 6 to 18 months. And during that time, they would expand their island empire, potentially all the way to Hawaii, and they would have a fallback zone where they could lose ground and they could bleed the Americans slowly, bit by bit by bit, if they had to go on the defensive. And to some degree, that's actually exactly what happened. But the Americans proved a lot more resourceful and a lot more lucky than they initially planned. And I'll end with that.
Yeah, so first of all, just to be clear, neither one of us thought that Japan was trying to invade America. That was just our hypothetical back and forth.
Sure.
Yeah, and I would agree with the Alaska thing, but yeah, that does sound dumb too. That's a lot of cold space you got to walk through. Maybe Central America. I'm not really. I don't remember the state of Mexico.
It's even farther away. The only reason, the only thing that they thought about was maybe trying to figure out how to break Panama, because they wanted to cut off the Panama Canal. But outside of that was the only interest that they had in the region. Everything else is even farther away from any base that they would have.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, that was mainly. Sisham's gonna have to remind me what the other parts were, because that's the thing I did.
The other part is in relation to our thought process with China and its reactions to Taiwan right now, where it's started to do more bolstering as of late, where it's doing a lot more forceful bolstering in accordance to Taiwan, and how World War II kind of affected the separation between Taiwan and China as it was at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, there was an indigenous people that resided in Taiwan, and then Japan basically conquered that area and took it over.
So, long story short, and this actually is before World War I, actually, is that you have Taiwan, which is largely Han Chinese. They had been an imperial province of whatever Chinese empire for the better part of the last 2,000 years, and they slowly got, flooded with Han Chinese, or if they were other, I don't know. Cantonese is not the ethnicity, but that's what they speak. But anyway, largely sees itself as Chinese. During the first Sino-Japanese War, and if I remember right, this is around 1900, is that Japan comes into the region, it's around 1890. Japan comes in the region, takes Korea, and takes Formosa, which used to be Taiwan, from China. And they basically established that as a base of operations. What eventually will happen in China later is that after the Qing Empire disintegrates and the Republic of China is formed, is that after a guy named Sun Yat-sen dies, he tried to he was basically the father of democratic China. After he dies in the 20s, basically the entire structure starts falling apart again, and China goes back to what it's seen for the last 5,000 years. Anytime that you don't have a central ruling government, you get a bunch of warlords, and you get a Chinese civil war. The two biggest factions in this, more or less, were the quote-unquote nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong.
So, okay, so Japan's intention at this point is obviously not to take over the United States. That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. They wanted to scare them off, create this buffer zone in the Pacific, so they can pad their way back. But that was just to defend themselves against the United States. But their real point, was to start seeping into China and the rest of the islands in that area, and eventually make their way west, right?
So, to a large degree, yes. The Second Sino-Japanese War starts in 1937. And some people actually talk about 1931, because in 1931, Japan literally has a bunch of rogue officers and generals invade Manchuria, which is a province of China at the time, and they set up their own client state, just literally without any orders or directions. They're just like, we're going to go pick a fight. And China is in such disarray they can't do anything to stop it. What will eventually happen 6 years later is you have the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where after Japan had consolidated what it had done in Manchuria, it launches a full-out invasion of China. And, of course, the next year is the Rape of Nanking, where more or less over the period of 2 years, Japan will come to dominate almost all of coastal China. But they are not able to give China a decisive knockout blow, because while they actually control the major population centers and most of the industrial zones of what China has, is that the peoples in the hills, particularly the communists, are able to really give China a nosebleeding anywhere that there isn't a goddamn railroad. And so Japan just isn't able to defeat China proper, because it's literally a people in the hills conundrum. Unironically enough, is that once you get away from civilization, you have to start colonizing these areas, and Japan is literally in this process of militarily colonizing China, trying to take over region by region by region, and that's a slow process. That is an incredibly slow process. And so, more or less, Japan actually wins the war by 1940. But because of the fact that they have to station like 3 million troops in China, slowly trying to take bit by bit by bit, it's an ongoing war and occupation that costs millions upon millions of lives.
So then they had to realize this. So what was the backup plan? That couldn't have been the end goal once they realized they're not taking China.
Well, this is the way that they saw it. They were in the process of taking China. They had basically accomplished all of their tasks at hand, outside of just wiping out the Chinese central government. But they realized they couldn't do it in one knockout blow. That was fine, because they were getting what they largely wanted. They were colonizing the area, and more importantly is that they were being able to extract resources, particularly steel, from mainland China, because there's no iron ore on Japan, or very, very little. So they needed to, they need to expand their imperial possessions to do that. And there's a lot of resources in mainland China, and they were able to extort and develop these areas for their own personal benefit. What they don't have is oil. And of course, once the United States in 1941 gives an embargo of both recycled steel and oil, everything starts going to shit in a real big way.
Okay. Yeah. Sister, was there anything else we were talking about specifically on that matter?
Okay, so it is. We keep jumping back and forth. So we've got the start. We've got the discussion that I was having with you was where today, in comparison. If you look at the different regions that are currently still kind of in play for like economic reasons and all of that, you can still see the remnants of things that happened in World War II and how those impact overall our current economic standing in the world. Sorry, I got kids in the background screaming.
It's all good, dude. It's called being a dad. Yeah. So the long short for me is that I want to pull up some numbers here that I just want to give people as a excuse me. I want to pull up some numbers here real quick because I ran this by Osiris, and people don't realize how strong the United States actually is during this period. Some people have an idea back then, but even back then, some people don't. Where is my thing? Oh, here we go. So I'm going to pull this nice little file up. All right, cool. This is by like 1990s numbers, but here's along this story. This is the economic data that we largely have for the world in 1938, right? So the United States is still in the is still in the grips of the Great Depression. Germany is rearming. Japan has been at war for the better part of a year. The United Kingdom and France are only now starting to like get their stuff going. I want to give you a couple numbers. The economy of the United Kingdom, $464 billion dollars. Excuse me, not trillion, billion. France, $310 billion. Germany, one of the best economies in Europe, $655 billion. The USSR, $780 billion. I'm going to hit Italy real quick and Japan. Italy, $245 billion. Japan, $261 billion. Are you guys ready for the United States?
Wait, what is this number referring to exactly?
This is their economic output in a nutshell. And I've got this factored if you want. But the United States, 1.3 trillion during this time. 30s? Yes.
Jesus. Awful.
Yes, this is literally in 1938, and still within the relative grips of the Great Depression. The United States is still stronger than two Germanys combined, economically speaking. And once you get the Americans on a war footing to where they mobilize and they're spending money and they're getting developed, that number is going to double over the course of 1941 and 1945. When the war is over in 1945, the United States economy is by these relative numbers at this time, effectively a $2.5 trillion economy. It's almost $3 trillion in 1945. Everybody else, go ahead.
So the rumor, the myth, or not the myth, the rumor is that Germany told Japan, "Don't fuck with the USA. That's not problems that we want to have." That would make sense. You think is this how this happens?
So here, unfortunately, that's not really what happens at all. So the Axis was never an alliance. It was supposed to be a mutually defense pact. And largely it was to contain the Soviets. The problem with the Axis alliance, in a nutshell, is that it isn't an alliance. And what I mean by that is that, in relative terms, Germany and Italy largely play by the same rules as far as trying to help each other out. Italy jumps the gun on a few things and they get their asses kicked, particularly in North Africa, but Germany is able to be there to support them and they're able to gain mutual objectives. Japan and the European Axis powers has some things that line up with each other, but they do not help each other. And what's even kind of worse, if you're, a simp for the Axis, I guess, is that they openly antagonize each other, if not completely go their own way. And as an example of this, one of the things that we see is that during 1939, you have the Soviets and the Japanese get into a massive border skirmish called the Battles of Khalkhin Gol. And Japan gets its ass kicked by the Soviets in this particular battle. 2 months later, the Soviets and the Germans sign a non-aggression pact called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where, one, they say, we're not going to fight each other. Two, we're going to split Europe in a secret clause, or Eastern Europe in a secret clause, so that the Soviets get all this land and the Germans get all this land, and they basically just divide up Eastern Europe. And the third is that they're actually going to mutually support each other the Germans are going to give technical training to the Soviets, and the Soviets are going to give Germany a bunch of oil and grain and things they need to prosecute the war against the Allies. A lot of people forget about that. So that rubbed Japan the wrong way, because this is literally just 2 months after having to deal with the Soviets. Ironically enough, is that Japan In 1941, signs a non-aggression pact in April with the Soviets because Japan doesn't want to fight the Soviets again because they get their ass kicked. What happens 2 months later? Germany invades the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. So yeah, they're not playing by the same game here at all. They're not supporting each other, hardly at all. They're not really playing, helping each other out. And this really will hurt the Axis in a lot of ways. It's not only just in the war against the Allies, but the war against particularly the Russians, which is the entire point of the alliance. As far as when it comes to the Americans, the Germans weren't really super pissed about it. In fact, they will declare war on the Americans personally anyway, December 10th. The reason why is that the Americans were functionally, even before the war, before Pearl Harbor, are functionally an Allied member at this point. As an example of a few things that are going on, the Americans started Lend-Lease at the beginning of that war, or at the beginning of the year. This is basically a program where we're going to lend war materials and war supplies to Britain, and then eventually the Soviets are put on that in late 41. And so we're already helping out Germany's enemies. And then you also have basically destroyers openly engaging German submarines in convoys all the way up to like the mid-Atlantic. So we're almost pretty much on a war footing. So whenever Japan bombs the United States, Germany just says, all right, okay, cool, mask off, let's go. And of course, they actually do a crippling bloody nose to American convoys at the start of the war. But anyway, that's other details.
Maybe it just feels like hindsight's 2020.
So again, okay, so you said details.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was trying to explain to Osiris. So what are these details? You're like, these details. There's reasons for that.
Yeah, sure. So when the war starts, where basically the United States goes to war with the entirety of the Axis, is that Germany is already upset with the Americans as it is because they're trading a crap ton of war materials to the Allies, particularly the United Kingdom, in order to support them and prop them up. When Germany has free reign to attack them or the Americans because they're now at war, the German submariners call this the second happy time. Because the Americans aren't convoying, they are not escorting their freighters or their tankers or anything. And so you've literally got German long-range submarines, the Type 9s, rolling right up to the United States coastline. And you've got American shipping traffic silhouetted against American seaboard cities. And you've got German submarines just torpedoing the living shit out of anything and everything they can find. Wait,
hold on. U.S. coastlines?
Yes.
The Eastern Seaboard, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to tell you in the conversation. Yeah. I was trying to explain that, and you were like, "Wait, no." And
I've heard that before, and I haven't heard it. It's like one of those things that nobody ever talks about. So that completely. Well,
yeah. I mean, there's reasons why nobody talks about it because it's kind of like dumb that it was happening. But how many? What was it? There were 13 Coast Guard ships that were literally shot because the reason they bolstered the Coast Guard at that point because they originally were non-militarized ships that just basically patrolled the harbors, right? I think it wasn't an act that happened in that point.
I actually don't know on that one. It's not something I'm aware of. What I can tell you is that the American Navy openly starts escorting British convoys and Canadian convoys once the British start saying, "Hey, look, we don't have enough crap for this." At the better part of June or July, and so you've literally got American destroyers engaging U-boats in August to September. In October, that really pisses off the Germans, and this is the point where they're like, "Well, we're not going to declare war," but it's pretty much to the point where the Germans realize it. Now, as far as the Coast Guard thing, I don't know. It's not something I'm.
Well, no, I'm talking about after Germany declared war.
I just still don't know. But after Germany declares war, is that you have the United States try to get on a war footing and. There's a lot of politicians and a lot of folks that are openly against it. And you've got Ernest King, who is Secretary of the Navy, or not Secretary of the Navy, Commander of Naval Operations at this point. He's slowly collecting things, and he hates the British. Anything the British tell him, he's just like, you guys can piss off. But eventually he kind of wakes up to the realization that the United States is not doing the right things. They need to convoy. They need to have blackouts in the middle of the night, and he's got a lot of political fights because America really doesn't mobilize for the better part of like 6 months. If you're talking about acting like they're at war, they'll have war jobs and they'll spend a bunch of money getting these factories online, but there's still a very active social life within the United States, and that doesn't really actually end until like mid 43. Is where a lot of people get their shit together and it's like, whoa, we're actually at war. You can't be doing all this shit. You actually might get bombed, all this other stuff. But it's ironic. By the time the Americans actually start acting like they're at war, most of the threat's already over.
You know what this feels like? You ever watched one of those videos about the history of the universe and how everything aligns to make this little blue dot called Earth to have people on it? It seems like there's so many billions or trillions of virtually infinite ways that if Germany and Japan hadn't done this one thing, it could be just so much different. Just so much differently.
Right. So as Tyberius was stating, so one of the craziest things was to impede some of the stuff that was happening. In 1941, the Coast Guard actually did an incursion literally 3 months before Pearl Harbor. The U.S. because they were running into U-boats in U.S. waters, and they did an incursion, and I think they sunk 3. If I remember correctly, this was like in September 12th, 1941. They sunk 3 U-boats that were literally 40 miles outside of New York City. Which, if you think about that, that's not far.
Yeah. I don't know how much of it's in territorial waters, but I can definitely tell you, even before the war, the Germans were absolutely engaging convoys almost as soon as they left Canada, or if they leave the United States eastern seaboard. And so technically 40 miles outside of New York City can be in territorial waters. It's only 9 miles, but basically once it crosses that threshold, it's open game for anybody to sink, as long as you're willing to accept the consequences. And Germany was pretty much all on board with under-6 submarine warfare at that point.
Yeah, but I think this had to do something with Greenland at the time. If I remember correctly, because I know the United States had some kind of they had the cutters were operating under the defensive treaty with Greenland, and moved to investigate a tip that a suspicious landing party was operating in a nearby ford. They investigated and found the SS Basoko or whatever. While interrogating the ship's master, they found signs that the ship was acting as a relay for Nazi radio stations.
I didn't know about that.
After that engagement, they almost got sunk by U-boats. And during that point, the Coast Guard was engaged, and they basically sunk the U-boats.
All right, fair enough. This is not a story I'm aware of, but there's a lot of stories from World War II that, kind of hang out in the rafters. People don't talk about.
Right.
A lot of moving chess pieces here.
Yeah. Well, the problem is, like, when we're talking about little stuff like this, like, these are smaller than pawns. These aren't even, like, these aren't divisions. These aren't armies. They're literally just little ships going about it and a little bit of espionage work, which is always, behind the door. Or at least it tends to be behind the door. When you actively see geopolitical chess pieces move, where you've got divisions getting dropped in, you've got giant convoys moving in, yeah, that's what everyone likes to talk about. That's the big shit. But if you guys had something after that, because I think you were still wanting to get to, like, how do we get to modern China, I think was still on the docket, but...
right, yeah, so if we want to shift over to that, that's fine.
Okay. So where I left off is that Japan is slowly colonizing China, more or less. And they've defeated the better part of most of the Chinese regular forces, and they've conquered the better part of most of the Chinese core. And that's the whole triangle thing. Watch my episodes on China's Country Spotlight if you have no idea what I'm talking about. Most of the Chinese coastline is taken. Most of the Chinese coastal provinces are taken. They're slowly working their way inroads. The problem here is that the two major forces are now relatively at parity, and that is the nationalists and the communists. Communists are smaller in a more localized area, but they haven't really gotten a bloody nose from the Japanese in the same way that the nationalists have. I'm going to fast forward a lot because while China basically, and both factions, play on the side of the Allies, is that they don't really do a lot to help beat back the Japanese. In fact, they're pretty much losing the entire war. In 1945, we're talking August, literally the day with the second atomic bomb struck. So August 9th, the Soviet Union invades Manchuria in Operation, we call it Operation August Storm. They call it the Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation. 3 army groups of the Soviet Union, battle-hardened troops from Eastern Europe, roll right into Japan, and they just wipe the shit out of them within a month. Manchuria is effectively under Soviet control, and this is actually like how you get the North and South Korea split today. Is you've got Soviet forces coming in from the north, and as Japan surrenders, Americans land in South Korea, and they literally meet in the middle. How you get modern China is that the Civil War is still going on, but they've largely put aside their differences to fight the Japanese. But once the Soviets roll in, the war is pretty much over. And what everyone does is that you have them taking stock. In southern China, you have the nationalists that largely will retake all their possessions from the Japanese. In northern China, you'll have the communists. And for the better part of 1945 to 1946, the war, as soon as the war's over with Japan, they go back to fighting. The nationalists win for the better part of the first 2 years. But what eventually will happen is that the Soviets will realize that their client state, their friends in China, are losing, and they are going to openly start supporting them with more arms and more materials and basically anything that the Chinese need to win the Civil War. From 1947 to 1949, the fortunes will reverse, and eventually you'll have communist China sweep over and take over everything except Taiwan, because the entire nationalist group gets up, leaves, and goes there. And so, in a long story short, is that how we get modern China is that the Civil War basically picks right back up as soon as as Japan is defeated, and after a series of engagements, communist China openly will win. And that's how we get modern China today, outside of talking about what happens in the Cold War. But that's Cold War.
All right, that makes sense. I didn't know anything about China, so.
So what about the Great Plan that the United States had during the rebuild, and how that plays into how China is seen today?
Oh, okay. So there's 2 relative rebuilds here. The first one is under Chiang Kai-shek during the 1945 to 1947 period.
No, I'm talking about the U.S. I'm talking about when the U.S. Basically became the major trading partner for everybody.
Okay. So this is the Cold War thing that I was talking about. So getting
this was at the end of World War II.
Right? No, it actually doesn't start there. Okay, so how we get modern China in a nutshell is that you have the communists win in the late 40s, or basically 1949, 1950, and they're formally on the communist camp. Problem: in 1953, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, dies, and there's the guy who's leading China. His name is Mao Zedong, right? He thinks that China is a major player within the communist apparatus, that China is basically on parity with the Soviet Union. The Russians don't see it that way, and this actually comes to a blow of egos, to where whoever takes over after Stalin is openly like, no, we're still the supreme communists here. You march to our orders. And Mao isn't really wanting to play that game, because he's like, no, I'm the oldest communist. I'm kind of awesome. It's our turn to lead. Well, anyway, that's unironically, that starts making a rift. And by the 1960s, that rift becomes the Sino-Soviet split, is what we call it. It will take a while, because basically what happens is through the better part of the 50s is that the Chinese will support the Soviets, but it gets an ever-increasing growth in distance. Over the 60s, it largely gets to a point where the Chinese and the Soviets just aren't talking to each other, and then you get Nixon going to China in 1971. And what Nixon does is that he brings the Chinese into the economic family that the Americans have built. And they're like, look, You don't have to openly say that you're on our team. You don't have to do any of this stuff. But here's the deal. If you help us contain the Soviets economically, you can be part of the American Free Trade Order. You can be part of all this stuff where you don't have to worry about going to war with anybody to get your stuff, because the Soviets actually aren't helping you that much. So you can buy oil from the Middle East, you can buy iron from over here, and you can do exactly what Japan has done. Fast forward a little bit longer, and you have the Reagan administration. And the Reagan administration has realized something. The computer is probably going to automate most American jobs away anyway. So what they're going to do is they're going to...
This.
Yeah. They're going to...
Heard this meme before.
Oh, thanks. What they're going to do, what they openly do is they're like, hey, look, we're going to do the whole free trade order on a colossal scale, because they think that it's either get technical in the Western world or go home. And so they're going to offer up all these low-end industrial jobs to anybody who wants it to be on our side during the Cold War. And China is first digs on this. They're already part of the alliance unofficially, but this is the part where they start doubling into it. And this is where all the Chinese social reforms and all the economic reforms really starts, is in the early 80s. Is that they're like, hey, look, we're going to start making all these special economic zones. We're going to participate in free trade. We're going to basically become basically the sweatshop of the world is how they refer to it. And they do. And by 1994, you had the first Chinese stock market. It's funny because 1980s is where they set it all up. And literally come 1991, when the entire system is no longer needed because the Soviets take a crap, is where China starts ramping up. And
why did the Soviets take a crap?
Whole other conversation. We'll get there in a minute.
Okay.
Anyway, what happens here, in a nutshell, is that China is allowed to propagate on this security policy because, one, the Americans have no fucking idea what to do the day after. We thought the Cold War was really never going to end. We never planned for it to end. So we don't know what to do. And the guy who actually was going to try to change it, his name was Bush. He got elected out of office. So it was up to Clinton, and Clinton did jack shit. The other part is this. If you're wondering why would we continue to help out another people, one, a lot of the ideas from both the Democrats and the Republicans was still the same. That we were not going to be able to have modern industrial jobs. We were going to have to be the service economy. We were going to have to be technicians. We were going to have to be something that you all had to have the college educated degree for. They might have been right, but that's a conversation for another day. Here's the point that is relative. Here's the point that is real. One, technical jobs for the United States, industrial jobs for China. That happened. And they thought it was going to make an economic new paradigm. It definitely did, but it might not have worked out the way everybody thought it was going to. The other side is this. Part of neoliberalism, one of the core tenets, is that they fundamentally believe that if you increase people's standard of living by a significant margin, they will become political actors and they will become politically engaged. And eventually what this leads to is democracy. This actually was a strategic gambit by the Americans to hopefully transition China into a democratic state. And here's the worst part. It was working until 2010. But that, again, another story. So 2010 or later, or we can do the Soviets. I don't care which.
Well, I don't know if System got something, but
So I'm interested in the Soviets. And then we can go to 2010.
Yeah, I was going to also say, okay, now we understand why America has such a stranglehold on the global, not a stranglehold, but so much of a big fist in the global economy. Where did Russia fuck it all up? Because it seems at one point they were on the trajectory to give us some problems, right?
You're not wrong. If you had asked most people in 1975 who was going to win the Cold War, both in the East and the West, most people would have said the Soviets. By 1985, that had completely inverted. So let me give you like a snapshot history, because I did a Cold War episode. This was 2 hours long, but here's the snapshot. The Americans and the Soviets have two entirely different plans on how to win the Cold War. The Americans kind of fiddle around for the better part of the 40s trying to figure out exactly what they're going to do. And then they kind of really put it all together under the Marshall Plan. It was originally an idea called Bretton Woods, but they reincorporated it with a few other things. And what eventually happens is this. The United States has a guns for butter policy. We need to convince Europeans and the Japanese and basically anybody who not only had been our allies during World War II, but people that we actually recently fought. How do we get them to stand shoulder to shoulder, side by side with us against the greatest military force that we've ever seen in the world? Because as bad as the Germans were and the Japanese were, the Soviets looked even more menacing. And in some regards, they were. This basically becomes a geopolitical bribe. The Americans put together the first free trade order in human history. They say, hey, look, anyone who is on our team can trade and buy from one another freely, and it will be protected by the United States Navy. So if Germany wants to buy these things, they don't have to go to war for it. Anyone within the alliance that can provide that resource can buy it from. It's the United States. So anything that pretty much anybody needs, the United States can largely supply, and vice versa. So you have what is the giant, you basically have a giant trade order that's formed out here. Germany, Japan, France, all these other places that have been bombed to hell or have been broken, they can import the raw materials that they need, and they can export their way back to affluence. Eventually, they'll add new members. They'll add post-colonial members. They will add, eventually, China gets on board to some degree. India tries to play on side with this, but it's a little touch and go. But eventually, what you'll have is that all of the American allies, strategically, economically, improve their standard of living by a factor of like 10. It's amazing. It's the biggest economic growth in all of human history, both in absolute and relative terms. The Soviet plan is kind of shit. But here's what their plan is. Their plan is that they are a centralized economic doctrine, right? They believe in central planning. It's not even like this state capitalism thing that China does today. It's not even that. It is direct. You are told what you're making, how much you're making, and how you're going to make it. And what they do originally is they openly extort Eastern Europe. They're like, oh, hey, we just conquered you guys. Here, give us all your goods. Well, after the Marshall Plan, they realize they can't do that. And so what they do is that they make their own economic doctrine where they're going to integrate anybody who's part of the Comintern, which is basically the Communist Economic Alliance. You're going to build this, we're going to build that, and they are going to build this. We're all going to trade. We're all going to be part of this integrated communist system. So everyone has their job. Everyone has their role, does all that. Two problems, actually. Number one, that system's almost always inefficient because, not to be a massive sim for capitalism, but capitalism allows people to work after their own interests, and it doesn't need some big government interference to openly get in the way of what is efficient and what actually works. Because one of the big problems with the Soviet doctrine here is that you've got like tractors being built in Czechoslovakia, and then you've got the planters being built in East Germany, and like the problem is that
government sucks at actually running businesses. Right?
On this scale, yes. Literally, this is a total absolute scale, and the problem is that it's one of these weird things to where they start building things just for the fact that they need people to have jobs and to work there, and that's fine. But it doesn't make economic sense to do some of the things that they do. Why are you building tractors in the Czech Republic? Why aren't you building them in Ukraine, where the tractors are fucking needed? It's just one of those things where it's like, all right, cool. Capitalism allowed people to largely go about things with less government interference, and so there was oversight, but there wasn't. How do you put this?
Management.
Yeah, there wasn't management that makes it ludicrous. And so economically, the Soviet Union will start dragging behind further and further and farther as it goes along. The other part here is that, I'm going to say this, the Americans have liberal democracy on their side. There's a lot of people, and particularly getting around 1968, where it looks like, liberal democracy is going to tear itself to pieces because people are pissed and they're upset, and you've got riots and all this other shit. But it allows people to vent their frustrations. They can say what they want, and you usually do see significant social change with this kind of system. It takes a while, but you usually get it. The Soviets don't have that. The Soviets have a totalitarian state. You have to abide by the doctrine, and if you get too much outside of your doctrine, if you're not willing to play within the Overton window,
you disappear.
You disappear. You end up in a camp. And so you see a lot less rigidity within the Soviet structure, both throughout the entire Eastern Bloc. And so you'll literally have nations that are like, no, we're going our own way. Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, excuse me, Hungary, where the Soviet army literally comes in and invades you again and installs a new guy because they don't like who's come up in your own nation. So eventually what happens is that I'm going to say that the Soviets largely collapse. One, because their economic doctrine is just way less efficient. And more importantly, their social doctrine is way less rigid. And eventually you'll have Mikhail Gorbachev that tries to reform the entire system, and it literally breaks out of sheer inertia. So that's the Soviets. But if you have any other further questions on that, feel free to hit it.
No, it's all it all lines up. Again, to use the analogy, it feels like the butterfly effect and the entire universe thing. Like so many things just lined the fuck up to get what we have today. But yeah, I don't have a question about that.
More or less. Sister, you got anything? I'm starting to think.
No, I mean, I don't have anything specific other than, you basically lined it out of, you can see the threads that go back, but if it isn't for the thread that goes back, and then you've got this little thread here and this little thread here, as we've made our decisions. So, do you think it's more of the Cold War or the World War II that really set us on the path for the transition? Or do you think that the impact of World War II lends itself into the Cold War, but the Cold War was just a different type of economic world war?
I'll put it this way, because if we're talking about the United States and China, I'm going to separate it. If we're talking about how we get the modern United States, it's World War II. Now, economically, we had been the biggest power economically in the world. Excuse me, repeating myself. We've been the biggest economic power in the world since literally 1890 or 1900. There's some big numbers there that we have to fiddle with, but we passed the British Empire definitively by about 1900. And literally, we are the number one economic power in the world. We're bigger than the entire goddamn empire. That includes India by 1900. All right, so economically, we're already there. Militarily, as a kind of just a gaffe here, in 1939, the United States military, the United States Army, is 185,000 people. When the United States leaves World War II in 1945, the United States Army is 8.5 million people. Wait,
say that again? 8.5 million?
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Yeah, we mobilized an incredible amount of people and resources into basically prosecuting the war effort. And that's just the United States Army. Of course, I do believe that the Air Force is included in that because the Air Force isn't separate until 47. Yeah. Anywho, what I'm getting here is that the United States militarily and politically aligns to who it's going to be with World War II to a large degree. And then everything else kind of follows suit in the early days of the Cold War. If we're talking about China, on the other hand, is that the Cold War largely is what defines where they are now. They originally were on the communist camp. They played largely what is central planning, and they played by those rules for a while. They didn't fucking like it because the Soviets kept telling them what to do, and they didn't care for that. But two, being on the Communist Alliance didn't really give them anything that they needed. And so eventually they go turncoat. Here's the crazy part. Unironically, we made the world's most fascistic state out of this system because they didn't adopt American ideals and American systems. Is that they didn't go into liberal capitalist democracy. They went into hands-off state capitalism and a authoritarian social doctrine that now has the Chinese social credit system, which got
now that was because of the turn in 2010. How did that happen? Like what instigated that? Because I mean, I know there's some changes that happened around that time frame in the U.S. and how our foreign policy worked at that point. But would you say that it's the impact of the American foreign policy that affected China into going that direction? Or is there something else, some other catalyst within the nation state itself?
There is another catalyst. And this is my own theory, and it's gotten a lot of attention. And I'm not going to say it's whether positive or negative. It seems to be a bit of a wash. So I will let you make up your own mind here. Before 2010, you have a lot of growing democratic movements within China. And like, just as examples here, like my teacher brought home a pamphlet that somebody had slipped to her back in the about 2006, 2008, somewhere in that range. She went to China, did a vacation there, did a tour. She met some people that were campaigning, underground for a democratic China. But anyway, make a long story short, she had a pamphlet. She brought it back, that kind of thing. She's just showing off.
Wait,
It's like, hey,
I'm sorry, I got a question. Well, your teacher is, I assume, a white lady.
yes.
And she's in China, and they're like, here's some political stuff because we want you to do what?
Okay, so largely what that kind of thing is that they're showing, hey, look, there's a movement for democracy within China. And this is exactly why the American foreign policy up to this point is exactly what it is. They want people's standard of living within China to improve, to people to have free time, to have leisure time, so that they become politically engaged, politically activated, and they can hopefully transition China into a modern liberal democracy, just like many other people had. And this has been the doctrine, this has been the culmination of liberalism going back since like 1848 or even older, is that most people think that because of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism and the rise of, or if you will, industrial capitalism and the rise of standards of living and wages within the Western world, we got democracy because of that. There's some truth in that. There's some wrongs in that, but in a general principle, I think it was correct.
Your video is messing up on my end. I don't know if it's on your end, or do you see that, Osiris, or is it just me?
No, it looks good here on my part.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Anyway, to finish out where I'm going with this is that was the plan, and it looked like it was working up until 2010, or a little bit later, 2011, 2012. There was a revolution that happened about that time that fundamentally rewrote the rewrote the rules for the world and how people socially interact. This is called big data and social media, and what it allowed people to do, particularly the Chinese government, and when it's not just the Chinese, we're talking about the Russians, we're talking about most of the authoritarian regimes throughout the world, is that if you don't have a compunction about privacy and political rights, what do? You scan everything that's going on within your telecommunications, and anytime these guys that you are keeping an eye on pull out their cell phone and say, hey, meet up on Tuesday, Democratic Action Committee group, whatever. You come in, you pay them a beating.
I was going to say that's the same thing we did, but minus the beating. Did.
And so what we've seen is that almost every major democratic process or democratic reform movement within the world has been largely shut down in the last 5 years or in the last 10 years. That is that's my theory.
So your theory is that you saw a lot of countries get influenced by liberalism and democracy during and post the Cold War, and then you're saying like the big data has all but killed that momentum.
Yes. I firmly
That's an interesting theory.
I've said this before, and I mean it. I'm going to repeat it again. Big data, social media, and the internet has now become the biggest threat to human liberty and freedom that we have ever seen, because anyone can now use that against you, whether it's a government, which even though we have Western governments that try to respect privacy, Patriot Act. If it's some nefarious actor, they can get into your bank records. They can steal your identity. If it's an espionage, or excuse me, if this is a matter of espionage, and we've seen this before, both here at home and abroad, people can get into your daughter's TikTok, and they can realize they're doing certain things, like they're going to school at this time or what have you, and you just slip a dignitary a note, and you're like, hey, we know your daughter goes to school at 9:45 a.m. every morning. If you don't want anything to happen to her, you're going to do this, this, and this. Have a nice day. This happens, and it's real. And it's a threat on not only people's national security in every way, shape, and form, but to their personal freedom and liberty, because anybody can do this to you if they want to.
Yeah, no, and it's going to get worse. Absolutely going to get worse. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to go into the technical side, but I don't think anybody here disagrees with that that part.